Fáilte roimh tróna go dtí agad a riag na héireann agus chuig an géad léocht sa trealéochtaí Colum Cille 1500 Téacsanna agus Traidisiúin. Is mis an mórí na ceann agus táiminn seach an fáilte speisialta go roimh ar ceann leabharlann an acadamh agus ar ceann chuiste léan na Gaeilge, litríoch na Gaeilge agus na Gultúir Celtach a deagraigh an trá a báirt le na chéile. You're all most welcome to the Royal Irish Academy this afternoon and to the first lecture in the series Columba 1500, Texts and Traditions. My name is Maureen McKeown and I am welcoming you here on behalf of the Academy Library and the Academy's Irish Language, Literature and Celtic Studies Committee, who co-organised the series. The lectures are one of a number of Academy initiatives to mark the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St Columba, née of Colum Cille. The series programme aims to foreground recent research on the Columban heritage across a range of academic disciplines, and also to highlight the rich Columban treasures held in the Royal Irish Academy Library. Ha fáilte chial ar cardan agus ar nábian as alaba, a dúchan an eile bhreatan agus a tíran céine eile lí sé derastar bhuain agus a ha cólar in ja. Ha sin ule tiction nach an an éireann a bhain a ha díleb Colum Cille. Ha is sonrichte cutrimach an dúlchas alaba agus dúchan an eile bhreatan cuideach. Míle fáilte roimh ma ha agus ha sin beo an dóchas gan bísih cólar in ag na hóráid an ule a bhíos agan sa tré seo. This afternoon, we are delighted to welcome historian and master calligrapher Timothy O'Neill, who will deliver the first lecture in the series. I will hand over now to my colleague and committee member and Talamh Pádraig Ó Machain, who will introduce Tim and chair the session. Gur míle maith
Gur maith Maureen, agus just before we begin, just to say to those in attendance that if you wish to ask questions of the speaker after the lecture has concluded, this may be done through the question and answer, the Q&A facility on your screens. We'll try to take a few of those questions at the end of the talk. Martin Chiar Chaintois na Strahishon on Talamh O'Neill, agus feran fáilte raig, agus gan buchas leis as teachta láthir inniuh chun labhart ar gathach agus ar Colum Cille féin. Today's speaker, Timothy O'Neill, will be known to many of you as a world-class and world-famous calligrapher and an acknowledged expert on Irish manuscripts. His best-selling book, The Irish Hand, is a standard reference work for the Irish scribal tradition from earliest times to the 20th century. And his earlier book on Irish trade in the medieval period, Merchants and Mariners, is one of the few sustained explorations of the Irish seafaring trade in the Middle Ages. In between those two works, he has produced monographs, written many essays, and delivered countless lectures and workshops in Ireland and abroad. Along with all that, he has pursued his artistic career, producing many commissioned works, including one recently on Colum Cille for the Royal Irish Academy. And he's also entered into collaborations with other artists, most notably with the late Seamus Heaney. Tim is adjunct professor with the Department of Modern Irish in University College Cork, where he was also inaugural Bull Artist in Residence. He has long had an interest in Colum Cille and his manuscript, the Cathach, and this is the subject with which Tim will begin this Colum Cille series with a talk entitled The Cathach, Colum Cille and the Foundation of the Manuscript Tradition. Now, Tim.
Gur mágad Pádraig agus Maureen. Is mór in an ordum sa bheith páirteach I gomór Colum Cille agus an léacht seo a thuairt. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to link Colum Cille with the manuscript tradition and to speak a little about practical aspects of that tradition. In Ireland, we are lucky to have three patron saints, Patrick, Bridget and Colum Cille, also known as Columba. Of the three, historically, we know most about Colum Cille due to the importance of his aristocratic family of origin, the monastic confederation he founded, and the cultural and artistic heritage associated with his monasteries. A most important aspect of that heritage is the manuscript tradition. the oldest representative of which is the book known as the Cathach. Sorry. The Cathach, which was produced in Ireland around the year 600 AD and has been cared for in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin for more than 170 years. The Cathach is considered to be the oldest Irish manuscript. It is a psalm book and once contained all 150 psalms of the Book of Psalms, part of the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament. Psalm books or psalters were among the most common manuscripts of medieval times, as the Psalms were recited daily by priests and monks. Indeed, it is a tradition that continues. There are 18 psalters with Irish connections written between 600 and 1200 that survive today. The most recently discovered was the Faddenmore Psalter in the National Museum of Ireland. Now, that was discovered in a bog in Tipperary in 2006. But the psalm book was more than a prayer book in medieval Ireland. It was also used as a textbook to teach reading, writing, and Latin in monastic schools. The phrase learning the Psalms at the time meant, in effect, primary education. The Psalter played an important role in the manuscript tradition. But returning to the Cathach, there are two reasons why the Cathach has survived for 1400 years. The first is because it is written on vellum, that is, prepared calf skin. And the second is because it was a revered object, a holy relic associated with St Colm Cille and preserved by his family. Today, the Cathach consists of 58 leaves. Originally, it would have had about twice that number. The remounted leaves measure 270 by 190 millimeters, or 10.5 by 7.5 inches, which in modern terms is a little less than A4. It is a plain book written in dark brown ink in a style that is the earliest known form of purely Irish script. Its ornamentation appears unsophisticated, but contains elements of the decorative treatment of letters, which became highly developed in later, more elaborate Irish manuscripts. Each psalm begins with a large, boldly drawn initial, and followed by letters that get gradually smaller until the opening word merges with the main text. Some of the initials contain simple spirals, crosses, or, as on this page, stylized animal heads, and have a surround of red dots. A few initials appear to have been colored with yellow. Sometimes spaces at the ends of lines are filled with simple line and dot decoration, which are formations made with the writing pen. The overall impression is that of a book copied by a competent scribe for practical use, for prayer, but also for study. As mentioned before, the writing in the Cathach is the earliest form of Irish calligraphy that we have. There were no books in Ireland before the arrival of Christianity on the island, less than 200 years before our book was written. The first books to arrive would have been in Latin and written in the style common at the time in the late Roman Empire. The script would have looked like what you see here on the screen, A closer look at the letters shows that the downstrokes of the letters are thick and the horizontal strokes are thin, like here in the E. This means that they were written with a pen which had a broad end or tip rather than a point. And this simple fact explains much about calligraphy. For well over 1,000 years, books in Ireland and indeed all over Europe were written with pens which had broad nibs rather than points. Let us imagine the scribe of the Cathach preparing to write, and it could well have been Colum Cille himself. He selects a number of goose or swan quills, strips off the veins and cuts off the ends so that they fit comfortably in the hand. Then he tempers the feathers, first by soaking the barrels in water and then heating them, perhaps with hot sand, as here in the slide. This treatment makes the ends as hard as modern-day plastic. Then the scribe can shape them with his penknife and cut off the points to leave a chisel-edged nib. This detail is very important, as quills were the primary tools of the scribes for centuries. There you see the saint with his pen in his left hand, is looking at the tip, and his penknife, that's where we get the word, in his right hand. Now, of equal importance was the vellum on which the texts were written. Up to the end of the 16th century, Irish manuscripts were written on vellum, which is prepared animal skin. The skins of very young animals were used because of their thinness. Thicker skins from older animals didn't work for book pages. Instead, these were tanned and used as leather. The skins used in Ireland were almost always calf skins. After being removed from the animal, they were buried in lime or left to degrade in water for a time. Then they were stretched and scraped to remove the hair from the outside and the fatty tissue from the inside. The skins were then trimmed and cut into the page size needed. To make a book, the trimmed pieces were assembled in gatherings or choirs, often in fives, in groups of 5. In the countryside of medieval Ireland, cattle predominated. The law tracts and the annals implied that great herds of milch cows roamed the land. And since most bull calves were culled, apart from the few needed for breeding purposes, vellum was not a scarce material. It was relatively easy to prepare and store, and the bigger monasteries in particular would have, over the years, no difficulty in building up and maintaining a supply of high-grade vellum. The next thing the scribe had to do was to rule the pages. This was usually done with a straight edge and a stylus or dry point that made a tiny groove on one side and a little ridge on the other side of the leaf. This can clearly be seen on many pages of the Cathach. The pattern of ruling would almost always have been the same as that of the book that was being copied. But before the writing could begin, all the pages had to be numbered in some way. This was because the scribes wrote on unbound leaves, and so it was easy to go by mistake from, if you weren't careful, from page 2 here to page 19 here. But this costly mistake was usually only made once in a lifetime. With the pages ruled and the pens cut, all the scribe needed was ink. By far the most common type of ink in Irish and European manuscripts, and that which was used in the Cathach, was made from crushed oak galls, plus water and iron sulfate. This mixture produces a very durable ink that etches itself into the vellum, actually more like a dye than a paint. Its durability is proved by the Fadenmore Psalter that we saw earlier, which was buried in a bog for 1,000 years and was still legible when it came out. As a matter of interest, iron gall ink remained in use until the Industrial Revolution, which brought in metal nibs. The iron gall ink is aggressive and corrodes metal or steel nibs. Hence, our modern inks are all synthetic. So, the scribe of the Cathach is now ready to write. His pen is dipped and the writing begins. The broad nib is held parallel to the writing lines so that the downstroke is thick, the whole width of the nib, and any side strokes like the top of an E or the top of a T or the crossbar of an E are thin. As we saw, the earlier Roman script used the same flat angle. Scribes using this flat angle and manuscripts using this flat angle are classed as majuscule. The golden rule for scribes is that the pen angle always remains the same when writing the text. The second thing we noticed when we look at a page is that the letters are detached. Manuscript books of whatever period were meant to be easily read by every literate person. This remained a feature of formal writing until printing was invented in the mid-15th century. But even today, printed letters in books are not joined up, which makes them easily read by every literate 21st century person. Let's take a moment to examine the script of the Cathach a little more closely and take note of a few key points. In the slide, of course, we're seeing the text far higher than the scribe himself ever saw it, far bigger. Remember that the pen always moves from the top down. So the letter O is made in two parts, down one and down the other side. And you can see clearly here, the D was the same, made in two parts, first here and second here. You can see in the magnification, the tiny little breaks. But before that, look also at the letter S here, which is made in three parts, but they don't join up well. In fact, this particular type of S, this kind of broken S, is a characteristic right through the Cathach. However, the most significant characteristic of the script of the Cathach is the addition of a wedge-shaped little bracket called a serif to the leading in strokes of the vertical letters, such as I. See the little bracket here. And you also see it here on the letter P, here on the L, here on the M, here on the U, and so on. Here's it, the I again, and here. This little serif, this was an innovation, an addition to the Roman script that didn't have such wedge serifs. It was a deliberate addition, an artistic addition, as it had no function other than to make the script more elegant. However, it did slow down the scribe, as an extra repeat movement by the writer was required to add the serif. The serif became a characteristic of Western scripts, but it's first noticed in our Cathach. Sometimes the scribe of our manuscript omitted to complete the serif, leaving just the thin leading in stroke. But we mustn't be too hard on the scribe, because according to a traditional story, he was writing rather fast. I give a general idea how the scribe of the Cathach wrote in the short sequence that follows. Just note how the serifs are added. Even though we cannot be certain that Colum Cille wrote the Cathach, we can be sure that he was a scribe. We have it on good authority, as his life, put together by Adamnan in the 7th century, mentions several times that Colum Cille was writing. In fact, we are told that he was writing a psalm book on the very day he died. Adamnan also mentions that there were other books Colum Cille had written that were still in the monastery on Iona. And a story in another saint's life, the life of Saint Berach, mentions that when Colum Cille visited him, he gave him a gospel that he, Colum Cille, had written with his own hand and as a sign of their agreement. Other casual references among the miracle stories of Adamnan's life of Colum Cille refer to manuscripts. For example, to the importance of having a text checked after the copying was finished. And there's also a charming story of how an awkward visitor came to see the saint and knocked over the saint's inkhorn. Adamnan tells us that in his time, which was the later 7th century, the books written by Colum Cille were regarded as having special powers. For example, his books were brought out when the community were praying for rain. He also recounts stories describing how Colum Cille's books were never damaged by water. It is part of this tradition that our manuscript, the Cathach, comes down to us. It was a treasured heirloom of his family of origin, the Connell O'Donnells. They enshrined it in the later 11th century. This shrine survives and may be seen in the National Museum of Ireland. An inscription on the older part of the shrine records and asks prayers for Cathal O'Donnell and Donal MacRobertig, the people responsible for having it made, and for Sitrick the craftsman, who actually made it. There's his name there, Sitrick Dorini, who made it. It was always kept for the O'Donnells by the MacRobertig family, and they were tasked with bringing it to battle to impart the protection of the saint on the army, hence the name Cathach, from the Irish Ca, a battle. Similarly, the Book of Armagh, known in medieval times as the Canon Fodric, was believed to have been a gospel book written by St Patrick, was likewise brought to the battlefield to provide what could be described as heavenly cover or firepower. Unfortunately, it didn't always work, as in 1178, when the Book of Armagh was found on the battlefield beneath the body of its keeper. And indeed, in 1497, the MacRobertig keeper of the Cathach was also slain, and the manuscript and its shrine captured. Colum Cille, while abbot of Iona and close to the last decade of his life, founded the monastery of Durrow in the Irish Midlands, a few miles north of present-day Tullamore, County Offaly. It was one of several monasteries he and his successors founded in Ireland, Scotland, and the Kingdom of Northumbria. It was here, or in another monastery of the Columban Federation, that about 100 years after our Cathach, the manuscript known as the Book of Durrow was produced. It is a manuscript of about 500 pages and is best known for its 11 fully illuminated pages. And these have been well studied, and the great variety of their designs using spirals, ribbon interlace, animal interlace, and repeating patterns of dots and diamonds has been pored over by art historians. But it is its vibrant script, which derived and evolved from that of the Cathach, that is particularly beautiful. We may note the same characteristics as we saw in our manuscript of flat pen angle, prominent serifs on the downstrokes, the 2-part O and the triple part S. Although today we are sure that the Book of Durrow dates to about 700, in earlier times it was held to have been written by Colum Cille himself, and it was this belief that caused the 10th century Irish High King, Flansinne, to have a shrine of silver plates made for it. This shrine, of course, is long gone, and we have a record that it was disappeared sometime in the 17th century. In the year 1007, according to the Annals of Ulster, less than 100 years after Flansinne had died, a manuscript referred to as the Great Gospel of Colum Cille, the chief relic of the Western world, was stolen from the sacristy of the Church of Kells, County Meath. Fortunately, it was recovered, although stripped of its gold, 2.5 months later. For this manuscript, the manuscript in question was none other than the Book of Kells. Today, it is one of the best known books in the world and attracts about 500,000 visitors annually to Trinity College, Dublin, where it has been kept since the middle of the 17th century. Like the Book of Durrow, for centuries, it too has been attributed to Colum Cille himself, but we know today that this is not possible. However, without question, it is a product of the calligraphic and artistic manuscript tradition that he did so much to establish in these islands. The script style, like that of the Book of Durrow, is nowadays referred to as insular majuscule. And in the Book of Kells, we may admire the perfection of the style that we first saw in the Cathach. The books of Kells and Durrow represent high points in the Irish manuscript tradition, but their fame can sometimes move our focus from the general tradition and from the hundreds of other more ordinary books that were copied for daily use by clerics, scholars, and teachers. For as we said earlier, before the year 1450, every book was handwritten. The production of practical books for general use led in time to a change in script style. In practical terms, it was a small change involving mainly an alteration of pen angle and a few letter forms, but its impact was huge. For what emerged from these seemingly small changes was a new script that we call minuscule script, the chief advantages of which were two: it could be comfortably and clearly written smaller, and because it was more compressed, it used less space and therefore less vellum. An early example of minuscule is a manuscript of a work we have referred to earlier on, the Vitae Columbae, the Life of Columba by Adamnan. Adamnan was a kinsman of the saint who was abbot of Iona. And what we're looking at in the slide is the oldest copy of the Vitae Columbae that survives. It was written out by a scribe called Durbena. A scribe, and Durbena is the oldest scribe whose name we actually know in the Irish tradition. And Durbena was briefly abbot of Iona before he died on the island in 713. Durbena, as a scribe, look up close, held his edged pen at an angle of about 40 degrees to the writing lines. This you can notice by looking at the end strokes of the A in particular, the blue arrows in the slide. And we recall that in the majuscule, the horizontal strokes, like the tops of the T or the cross stroke of the E, were thin. Now in the minuscule, we see that they are the same thickness as the vertical downstrokes. So the same thickness for the top of the T here as this part of the T, the same thickness of the horizontal stroke on the E at the top. So another way of looking at this is if the scribe were to make a cross before beginning to write in minuscule, both arms of the cross would be the same thickness. If the scribe was writing majuscule and he made the same cross, the downstroke would be thick and the horizontal stroke would be thin. There is also a new form of the A that's characteristic of minuscule script, and in fact it's one of the deciding factors. Also, the long form of S is used predominantly in the minuscule. So here we have the two main scripts of the Irish or insular manuscript tradition, and we have them linked to Iona and to Colum Cille. Now, Latin, up to now, all the manuscripts we have looked at have been in Latin. Latin was taught in Irish monastic schools to a high standard, but as a foreign language, as Irish remained the vernacular in Ireland. When Irish came to be written, it was the more compressed minuscule script that was used. But the minuscule script was in use also for the Latin script. Here what we're looking at is a textbook, a Latin grammar book, where the teacher writes his Irish notes between the lines in the Irish language. The main text is also in minuscule, but in a larger size, the Latin text here. Now, I mentioned to you that the minuscule could be written in a very small size, and the teacher's notes here are in fact less than 1 millimeter in height. It is also interesting to note that in the Irish monasteries in Northumbria, the local Anglo-Saxons were taught to write their vernacular in the very same minuscule, and that script remained in use in England for writing the vernacular until the Norman conquest. In appearance, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon document looks not that dissimilar to one written in Irish from around the same date. Now, moving ahead quickly, after the political upheavals and the so-called church reforms in Ireland in the 12th century, the Irish manuscript tradition passed from the monasteries into the hands of learned families, many of whom, of course, had links to the older monasteries. These Gaelic families specialised particularly in law, medicine, and history, and they were a respected elite in late medieval Irish society. The families were very much part of the scribal tradition, as copying manuscripts was part of the training in their various disciplines. Here we see a manuscript called Seanchas Mór, which belonged to the learned family of MacEgon or MacEgan. It is an example of a Brehon Law manuscript written in minuscule throughout with pens of different thicknesses to distinguish the main text from the commentary. Apart from writing their specialist manuscripts, the learned families were commissioned by Irish kings to compile books, great big books in Irish for them, with a great variety of material. This included family genealogies, ancient sagas, both Irish and classical, poetry, place name lore, and saints' lives. These manuscripts were highly prized status objects and were even used and swapped to ransom important prisoners. We're looking here at the Book of Ballymote, which was acquired by the O'Donnells in the early 16th century in exchange for 140 cows. The Book of Lismore, now happily in UCC, University College Cork, was originally a manuscript that belonged to the McCarthy-Ray family, as well as ancient Irish tales and a version of the Travels of Marco Polo. It also contained a life of Colum Cille, which you see in front of you. One of the last great vellum manuscripts in Irish is the 16th century Bacha Colum Cille, compiled by the learned chieftain Manus O'Donnell, who undertook the work, he tells us, because of his affection and brotherly love for his high saint and kinsman in blood. The scribe of the manuscript was Gilla Rivach Mór O'Cléric, but it is somewhat in the style of contemporary printed books that the manuscript has a frontispiece showing Colum Cille as a mitred abbot in full pontificals. Colum O'Coig will speak in detail about this manuscript later in the lecture series. We began with the Cathach and noted how closely linked to Colum Cille that manuscript always was. We looked closely at its script and serifs and saw it as the prototype of insular majuscule script that in the years that followed resulted in the masterpieces of calligraphy that were the Latin Gospel books of Doro, Lindisfarne and Kells. When it came to writing the Irish language, we noted how the sharper angled minuscule script was always used right down to the 20th century. There was one exception, however. The text of the famous eulogy of Colum Cille that was composed in Old Irish shortly after his death, and will be discussed in the next lecture in the series. The text, though in Irish, was always written out in the older majuscule script. In the detail here, we see it surrounded by a commentary in minuscule. The scribes, through the centuries, distinguished this text from the commentary, not merely by writing it larger, as they used to do, say, in the Brehon Law manuscripts, but also by writing it in the majuscule style. We might see this tradition as a visual tribute to Colum Cille, the scribe. On the 1500th anniversary of the saint's birth, a verse from the same poem with an English translation is featured in the artwork called Crinne Colum Cille, the world of Colum Cille. Both verse and translation are written in majuscule and refer to the saints moving to Scotland. The outline of the coast and the islands of Tory, Rathlin, and Iona may be discerned and the four corner panels make reference to the Cathach, the Book of Durrow, Book of Kells, and the Colum Cille. It is offered the Colum Cille Indu an nail, neb si scribned immuno equivna. It is offered as a tribute to the founder of the Irish manuscript tradition. Turning from Ireland as he had pledged. Here you see the two scripts, the Irish and the English, written in majuscule. The insular majuscule suits very well the writing in the English language too. Garimahakut.
Hi, Tim. Thanks very much. Dielet. As a gaint It was a wonderful talk and brought very much to life not just the Cathach but Colum Cille and of course the Irish manuscript tradition also. We can take questions through the Q&A platform or facility on Zoom at the bottom of your pages. I should say that we had in excess of 150 in attendance, Tim, at your talk there, which was a magnificent number. We have one question in the Q&A at the moment, and that's from Maureen Aurchain, who is asking if we can assume that all early scribes were right-handed, or can it be deduced from the writing which hand was being used, which hand was used?
I don't know if it can be deduced from the writing, but I think it's most likely that they were right-handed. There were all kinds of pishogues and traditions about left-handed people, as well as red-headed people and so on. But I think there's one very peculiar story from a saint's life. I think it was the life of Cathach. He was writing a gospel by night, but we are told that miraculously his right hand turned into 5 candles so that he could continue writing. Well, if that was the case, he was definitely writing with the left hand. But I'm afraid I couldn't say whether the left-handed can it be distinguished. I don't think it can. When the handwriting manuals were developed in the 16th century by the Italian writing masters, they always had a treatise. They always had a few chapters for left-handers as well. So it was a recognized feature of scribes, all right.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And we have a further question then, asking if the scribes ever mixed iron gall ink with lampblack to give a better lasting results.
The iron, I don't know, and I think there's ongoing experiments and the project and the materiality that of the manuscripts that maybe perhaps you might be able to talk about later. But personally, I prefer to use the lampblack, the carbon ink. The piece that I showed you, the last piece there, that's still maybe in the background of the presentation, that was done with the Japanese, which is carbon ink. Both inks, iron gall and carbon, were used in the Book of Kells. The lampblack is not as durable. It's more like paint. It sits on the surface and it can wear off and it can easily be scraped off. So I think far more of the oak gall ink was used because of its durability.
Yeah, and if I can chip in, you mentioned there the project that we're running. The ordinary inks used in the body of the text are invariably made from iron gall, are iron gall inks. but we are getting readings of carbon mixed through the iron gall for some of the large initials, but we need to pursue that further. Another question there is inquiring about your own tribute to Colum Cille. That is Crina Colum Cille, the last couple of slides in your presentation, asking where can that be seen?
I think it's in the Academy at the moment, but I think there's it's only one of several pieces that were commissioned by the Academy to mark the occasion of the 1500, and it's being kept in the Academy at the moment, but it's not on public view. I think it will be eventually, I suppose.
I think there are plans for a grand unveiling at some point in the future when the COVID restrictions are relaxed a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Jim. Yeah, Leonard.
Yeah, it's on a. You could see it was on a full skin, and stretched out on the linen and so on. So it's as traditional as I could make it in that sense.
Yeah, it's a remarkable piece. What are the dimensions? What are the dimensions of the full skin again, Tim?
Well, I think it was about a metre square, really. I think.
Yeah, around that. Yeah, so so when it will be available for viewing in the Academy, it'll be well worth people calling in to have a look at it, certainly.
Okay.
So lots of complimentary messages for you, Tim. There's a question there: do we know what battles the Cathach may actually have been brought into? Are there signs of wear and tear?
There's certainly signs of wear and tear on the Cathach. You can see that the edges of all the pages are missing. I think when the shrine was opened in the 19th century, people didn't know what to expect inside it. I think at the time, the tradition of the manuscript might have been even forgotten. I think there was at that stage they thought there were bones or something in it, and but it was always the book was always there. But you can see all the corners are gone. It was rattled around so often inside in the box, which was sealed, that the corners were knocked off of it. I mean, it went to the continent after the siege of Limerick. It was taken away by one of the Irish O'Donnells, brought it to the continent, and it was there for quite a long time, and then came back again and ended up in the Academy, thankfully. But it had quite an adventurous life. Yeah. Yeah,
and when it was opened, when it came back to when it was opened in the early 19th century, a lot of it had gelled together, so we don't know what was actually lost in that process also. Mm-hmm. But as regards identifying individual battles where the Cathach was displayed, I don't know if we have a record of that, Tim.
I think there's the one where it was captured is mentioned, all right, the 1497, okay. Obviously, but I don't know of the others. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Another question there about the quality of the light that was I suppose exploited in the writing of manuscripts. Do we know? Have we any idea? The questioner is asking as to how much natural as opposed to artificial light might have been used.
I think they avoided artificial light as much as possible, and that's why in the marginalia, which I didn't talk much about, but it's very much part of the tradition, people writing comments, or scholars writing, or scribes writing in the margin, that about the conditions under which they were writing, and sometimes they complained that the day was dark, and it made life more difficult for them. But I think they just didn't write. It's too difficult to write if the conditions aren't clear, if you can't see properly. And it's not so much what you're writing yourself, it's the book you're copying from. I would hazard to say that 95% of all books were copies. They were always copying from another book. So if you couldn't read that properly, then you had a great difficulty in writing. So the the light was important. And sometimes they complain if they're made to write in bad light or in the evening time or something like that. You get the odd complaint scribbled into the margin of a text saying that it's unfair to be asked to write at this time or whatever.
Yeah, so I suppose the answer is really that the books that we have are the product of daylight wherever possible. Yeah. I
would say so, and also light coming from the left side. You know, that's very important.
Yeah.
Solas on Dave play. Yeah.
Yeah. For the right-handed scribes anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a question about
just one other thing about the writing there. It was possible to write, see the red writing, for example, in the Cathach. You just put the you just make up the ink, the color, and you'd write with that just as you'd write with ink. You'd write with the paint just as you'd write with it. And it's no more difficult to write with watery red paint than it is to write with ink.
Yeah.
So there's no problem writing with color.
Very good. There's a question about the Edinburgh Psalter, Tim. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's a later, very highly decorated, coloured Psalter, written in Irish minuscules, according to the questioner Down Burgoyne, asking if that was written in Ireland or could it have been done by Irish trained monks or nuns?
Certainly could. The date, what date does he, is there hazard for that?
I think it's 11th century, off the top of my head now, if not indeed in early 12th century. Yeah,
well, I mean, the minuscule, as I said, was in use all over in the boat islands. They were using the minuscule script, and it had sort of passed into the European tradition at that stage. I couldn't say exactly. You know, if you're writing in insular minuscule of that sort, it was hard to distinguish whether it was done in which island at that late stage. I think to be certain, it's almost impossible to say.
I suppose we could nearly say it wasn't written in Edinburgh, but apart from that, I don't think it was signed. I think it's quite possible to have been written in Gaelic Scotland as much as Ireland. There's a question about the early Irish print type and its relationship to. Well, let me just get this right. How does the early Irish print type relate to these presented writing types? Yeah. So the connection, I suppose, between the early print in early printed books in Irish, Tim, and Irish script and the Gaelic script.
Yes, well, the oldest Irish print types, Dermot McGuinn is a great expert on this in his book, and he shows clearly how the earliest Irish print in that sense was modelled on the 16th century handwriting, which was definitely more the minuscule style. It was in the mid-19th century that George Petrie went back to the majuscule and designed the most beautiful font based on the majuscule for Irish, and it was used in the first edition of the Annals of the Four Masters, so Donovan's Four Masters. Beautiful to see Irish in this lovely rounded majuscule type. But before that, and subsequently, it really didn't catch on though, that you won't find much Irish type referring back to majuscule, apart from those Petrie hands. It was always the minuscule that was used as a model and kept right up to the very end. And in fact, ordinary people's handwriting in Irish in school up until the 1960s was also basically a minuscule, although at that stage pointed pens were being used so that the thick and thin it wasn't the feature anymore.
Yeah, and of course the early printed books in Irish, if you like, they adapted what was current at the time in Gaelic manuscripts as best they could. Of course, it was a challenge for the typecutters and so forth. Yeah. There's a question about word spacing, Tim, in the Cathach. That we don't have word spacing at least not in any advanced format, but there is word spacing according to the questioner, Thomas McShane, at the beginning of sentences. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a very general comment on the Cathach. I think it's very well laid out. I mean, it looks to me like very clearly written a study book as much as a prayer book. There's one of the things that struck me is that there's absolutely no attempt to go easy on the vellum, to spare the vellum. The pages are so well laid out, and the word spacing and the lettering is very well spaced out, it seems to me. And there's considerable space left between the words. I don't think there's any attempt at all in the Cathach to make it compressed or so on. It looks like a very, very generous layout and so on. By the way, there's good evidence because of the Irish remaining a vernacular in Ireland and not Latin, that the Irish were among the first, if not the first, to introduce word spacing in the writing of manuscripts to make it easier for them to read Latin, which wasn't, as the common language.
Indeed.
So,
yeah, one of our contributions to civilization, Tim.
Apparently, yeah, not a bad one either. Yeah.
No, indeed, absolutely. A question about whether the Cathach is going to be on public display this year. I don't have the answer for that. I imagine it will once the COVID restrictions are lifted. It's regularly on display.
Yes,
it's one of the features of the Royal Irish Academy how generous they are, the library, how generous they are with regard to manuscripts placed on display. So I would imagine that we should just watch the space for that.
yes.
Question about cattle being exchanged for manuscripts. Were cattle the only currency used for exchange in manuscripts?
No, there were people as well. There were many cases of prisoners being exchanged for manuscripts. I mean, probably the most famous after was the Anglo-Norman Edmund MacRichard Butler, the commander of the Butler forces against the Desmonds at the only battle of the Wars of the Roses in Ireland. He was captured by the Desmonds, carted off to Askeaton or Newcastle West somewhere, and his ransom was agreed. Very simple, 2 books. His 2 books. One was now known as Laud 610, which is in Oxford, and the Laurigar, which is missing. But 2 manuscripts, written complete Gaelic manuscripts, were considered a ransom for the value. Give you some idea of the value that was placed on these books in the late medieval Irish society. That was a prince's ransom.
Yeah, very celebrated case, as you say yourself. That's right, the Battle of Piltown.
Yeah.
A student of my own is asking here, Anne Alcorn, and greetings to Anne, is asking what would have been with regards to wastage, Tim, when the page had been, or when the bifolium had been cut out and in preparation for writing, what would happen to what we use for was made of cut-offs? Would you have any comment on that?
Yeah, they were. I'd say they were used for vellum is almost an indestructible material. That's very important. That's another reason why we have the manuscripts. Paper wouldn't have survived in boxes like in the Cathach for shrine or whatever. So the little fragments would have been probably used they were used later on as binding fragments. They were used as perhaps part of the binding of a manuscript. They could be chopped up and boiled up to make a glue, an adhesive from the fragments of the vellum. And of course, the small bits were used for practice by trainee scribes. I keep all my little bits and pieces of vellums to try out something, and or to just it's a valuable enough. It's very valuable material today. I was mentioning there that maybe it wasn't quite as valuable as people like to make out in more earlier times, because there were so many of these animals knocking around, and the monasteries themselves had great big herds. But I'd say it was used primarily by students to cut offs, and I would also say that it could have been used as like binding strips.
Yeah, and just from my own, just to chip in as well, we find pieces, cut-offs being used to record deeds, short deeds, legal deeds in the 16th century on vellum also. And some of those pieces or deeds are written on cut-offs. There's a question about preferential use of certain dyes and inks for illumination in some monasteries compared to others. Have we any comment on that, Tim?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's very, very difficult to, it's only more recently, very, very recently, that they have positively identifying, using more scientific methods now, non-invasive ways of looking at the colors to find out what materials were used. But it's not clear. They're pretty standard, you know. The minium, the red lead was the red most commonly used, and the orpiment, the realgar or orpiment, the arsenic sulfide, was the yellow color. And I mean, the quantities were so small that I'd say you could safely say that if you had 2 kilos of orpiment, you could do all the Irish manuscripts that survive. So I mean, we're talking tiny amounts of color that were needed, you know, and used in manuscripts. The amount of paint used, very, very little. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Many complimentary messages coming through all the time, Tim, and we're at the 2 o'clock limit now, and there's still questions there. I'll just compress 1 or 2 more, Tim, and we'll leave it at that. There's a question about if books were ever dictated, if manuscripts were ever dictated to the scribe.
Yes, I'd say yes. That was sometimes the case. There is Adam Nawn has a story about visitors coming to the monastery, a man who had been to Jerusalem, and he was telling his story, and Adam Nawn sent for wax tablets to be brought and a dictation to be taken down on wax tablets. These were the sort of the jotters of the early monastic period, coming through from the Romans and so on, that they wrote on these wax tablets and then could be taken down from dictation and then transcribed afterwards.
Yeah, and we have evidence in the later tradition then for texts being, particularly translated texts such as medical texts, being dictated and taken down by a separate transcribed. Healing, any healing properties associated with manuscripts?
If you believe in miracles, yes, I think.
Yeah.
I know there were relics. I mean, apart from that, I don't know. I mean, the Cathach was relic. There were other manuscripts that were enshrined as well, and any ones that were in boxes like that they're used for swearing oaths and things. And you invoked the saint and the protection or otherwise of the saint if you broke your promise sworn on the manuscript.
Wasn't the Book of Dara supposed to have been dipped into water as a cure for cattle, I think, or something like that?
That's Colum Cille in the 16th century observed it being used by the farmer. He says putting water on it. No, some people think there was only maybe a section of it that was dipped, and John Gillis was saying that part of it you can see one section has gelled from exposure to water. So
just a final question then from Meg Bateman, and greetings to Meg over in Scotland. Was writing, the act of writing, considered a separate skill from the art of, let's say, illumination, as you find in the great carpet pages of the early gospel books? Were they 2 separate skills?
I would think they were, but I mean, a good scribe would be able to do, I mean, very simple illumination. But I mean, if you're talking about just painting, that's, you know, you're just dropping color in. But if you're creating designs and so on, I think that can often be a separate skill, creating the patterns and so on. Yeah,
absolutely. So Tim, I think we'll probably leave it at that. We've gone past our time, and I suppose the volume of comments and questions in the Q&A is a testament to the excellence of your talk and the fascinating nature of it as always. And a quick mention of next week's lecture, September the 1st. There will be 2 speakers, Maureen Nironachu and Jacopo Bisagni, under the title of Politics, Piety and Poetry, Early Columban Texts and Traditions. So that will be that will certainly be not to be missed. Tim, on behalf of Cúisle and the Gaelna and on behalf perhaps of everyone listening and attending in attendance today, as I said, we had over 150 there. I want to thank you for a tremendous lecture as always, and absolute jewels of information that could only come from someone who is not just a scholar but a practitioner as well. And I suppose until you've done this, there are certain things that will remain secrets to the rest of us. So thank you for sharing that with us. We'll take our leave of everyone now, and thanks everyone for their attendance. Tá live, go to Mina Mahagath. Slán.